Okay, so we've looked at the rise and fall of Napoleon, and we've looked at the rise of the Industrial Revolution and all the resources these industrialized nations needed in order to keep these factories running and the profits being generated. So that, of course, led to the age of imperialism that we kept talking about in the previous lessons. Now's the time for topic 11.5, the scramble for Africa, where the goal here is for you to be able to explain how industrialization, technology, and global competition led to European nations finally being able to build these overseas empires during the age of imperialism, specifically in places that they've long wanted to colonize but had been unable to up to this point: Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. The key question that we're going to be focusing this lesson on right now is, why did industrialized nations suddenly begin competing for colonies in the late 1800s? So yes, they had competed for colonies in North and South America in previous centuries, but the revolutions kind of kicked them out of there. So they needed new places to colonize for those resources for their mass industrialization. That's what we're looking at in this lesson, a new age of imperialism. So industrialization really did change the balance of power in the world. There were the countries who had industrialized, who are what we call more modern economies, and countries that are still developing that don't have the industrial base yet. Factories during this period, and still even today, require enormous supplies of raw materials, whether that's coal, whether that's iron, cotton. This is what rubber looks like when you're collecting it from a rubber tree. Yes, it comes from trees. Or oil. These are resources that you need to run your factories. The problem is, with a few exceptions, the countries that industrialized didn't have race supplies of all these resources inside their own borders, so they needed to conquer new areas to get access to those resources. Because what were you going to pay for it? But you also needed markets to sell these manufactured products to, right? Making things is one thing, right? Now you have to find people to buy it. And there's only a certain number of people within your country, so you need to go and conquer other countries to force them to buy your products, because how else are you going to make money? But with this industrialized base, these nations were also able to develop new powerful technologies that allowed them to conquer these other areas. All of this combined created that intense competition between the industrialized nations for the resources, markets, and global influence over the rest of the world. So you had these European global empires that had industrialized, and now they're competing with each other for resources, for their factories, for markets to sell these products to, and to just prove that they have more power than the other ones, right? It was a giant game of who's tougher. By the late 1800s, Europe became the center of industrialist production, right? America was also becoming an industrial powerhouse at this time, but Europe is the first center of industrial production. Many regions of Africa and Asia remained agricultural economies. That is, most of the people in those continents, their work was done to produce food, not in factories. And it's the industrialized nations gained technology and military advantages over these agricultural economies who didn't have the same ability to fight and resist. It is that industrialized power that allows European nations to really expand its influence beyond its borders, far beyond what they were able to do in the previous age of exploration and colonization. This is where we need to define what imperialism is. It is a policy in which a country extends its power over controlling territories and people beyond its own borders. That is to say, you've got the main home country, right? You've got Great Britain. Well, they want to expand their power and influence, so they invade Ireland and they colonize it. Then they colonize the Americas. Then they colonize Africa. Then they colonize China, right? This is what imperialism is, taking over other countries and having power over the land and people who live there. And as I keep mentioning, these nations, these empires, were competing for control over land, resources, trade routes, and markets. This period of rapid expansion of these powers is known as the Age of Imperialism, from 1850 to 1914. This is also while the United States is going through this as well, as America starts to colonize the western half of the continent, but also Hawaii, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, Cuba. We also have a lot of influence of during this time. And this really is the imperial equation that you should understand for how this is happening, right? Industrial expansion was not random. So industrialization plus new military technology plus global competition plus the structural vulnerabilities baked into all civilizations, this all leads to Europeans entering their age of imperialism. They all combine to drive Europeans to expand across Africa and Asia. So remember that industrialization plus new technology for the military, plus competing globally, plus the structural vulnerabilities that already exist, is how you get imperialism. These industrial economies created strong incentives for that expansion because, again, as I kept saying, the factories require large quantities of raw materials: coal, iron, cotton, rubber, and oil, all things that the countries that have industrialized don't have within their borders. They also, again, need those markets to sell to. Are you seeing a theme here? Yes, I'm trying to make sure you remember this. And by directly controlling territories overseas, this would guarantee them both access to the resources they need for their factories and markets that they can guarantee to sell these products to. Here in red, you can see what the British Empire looked like at this time. In blue, you can see what the French Empire looked like. So this whole imperialism thing was essentially a contest for power and prestige. European leaders believed that if you are a powerful nation, a powerful people, then you should control a large empire that controlled other nations. These colonies were a demonstration of the strength of your own nation. Your global influence, how much control you had over the world, depended on how much territory you controlled. And competition between the British, the French, and everyone else in Europe created an intense race for more colonies as they just started carving up the rest of the world for each other. This imperialism was also justified by some pretty powerful and terrible ideas. For instance, racism. Europeans believed they were superior to other peoples and thus had the right to rule over other people. And then they took the idea of Darwin's evolution and they applied it to societies as a whole. They call this social Darwinism, the idea that strong nations, strong groups of people, had a natural right to dominate the weaker ones. This is America's manifest destiny, right? America has the right to go west and take over those lands because American culture was superior to the native cultures of those lands. That is not true, but that's what Americans believed. And of course, Europeans were doing the same thing in Africa and Asia, saying, well, our culture is better, we're a stronger nation, so we have the right to dominate those who are weaker than us. And some Europeans even believed that they had a duty to spread their culture. They sent missionaries and reformers across these areas to spread Christianity, Western education, and European cultural values. Many Europeans believed that they were bringing so-called civilization to other societies. This is why I spent so much time in previous units talking about how complex and impressive the cultures were in Africa, Asia, and the pre-Columbian Americas before we got to Europeans interacting with them. Because the Europeans of this period said those cultures weren't civilized and Europeans had the duty to bring them civilization, which is of course ridiculous. They refer to this as the white man's burden, as they saw it as the duty of white people to civilize non-white people. And again, boy howdy, that is a racist idea. Now, for centuries, Africa had remained independent from European control, which, again, this is Africa, this is Europe, but Europeans went all the way across the ocean to colonize and conquer North and South America before they really started to conquer and colonize most of Africa. Why not Africa first? Well, there were several things that were keeping Europeans from expanding into Africa, right? Tropical diseases such as malaria were all over Africa, and European lifestyle just wasn't conducive to this, right? Europeans like to live close together. They like to build their villages, their cities really close to water supplies. Well, that's where mosquitoes like to breed, and so the mosquitoes brought malaria and killed off a lot of Europeans. Africans, on the other hand, they built their civilizations in a way that kind of accounted for this and made it harder for malaria to spread in their populations. But Europeans saw themselves as superior, so why adapt the way you do things to the way that the local cultures do? Because obviously, they are not civilized. Again, racism led to a lot of people dying. And then, while Europeans could colonize kind of the coast here, they took over some trading ports, the interior of Africa was just difficult for them to get to. The rivers were just terribly difficult to navigate, and the interior is just very difficult to navigate as well, as it is a massive continent. So how do you cross all these areas quickly with resources and soldiers? On top of that, Africa had very strong kingdoms and empires and trade networks of their own. They had no need for Europeans' resources because they had everything they needed from the trade networks they had already established with other parts of the world. And these strong African kingdoms and empires had strong militaries of their own that could keep Europeans out. And Europeans just did not have the technology necessary to conquer the interior of this continent. So Europeans kind of stuck to the coasts here, right? And they created trading posts, which became the basis of the Atlantic slave trade. But pretty much other than the coast of the continent, that's as far as they could go for most of this period up until this age of industrialization. But by the late 1800s, things began to change. New technologies allowed Europeans to move into Africa's interior. One of the key developments included quinine. This is a medicine that protected Europeans from malaria. Well, it protects everyone who takes it, but Europeans were the ones who really needed it because they were going into these areas to conquer them. You've got to indulge me for a minute here because one of my favorite stories here is that quinine it comes from these tree barks, right, from this tree over in South America. So it's discovered during the colonization period of South America, specifically by Catholic priests. They noticed that local populations, when they chewed on this bark, they didn't get sick from all these tropical diseases, and so they kind of quickly, through the scientific revolution, it was figured out, wow, you can use this tree to manufacture this medicine that keeps you, if you take it regularly, will keep you from getting malaria. Well, because it was Catholic priests who quote-unquote discovered it, Protestants didn't like to take it. One prominent Protestant, Oliver Cromwell, yes, the guy from the English Civil War, died of malaria because he refused to take a Catholic cure to the disease. At least that's one account for how he died. There's other stories. We're not 100% sure how he actually died, but we know that he didn't want to take this medicine because it was Catholic. Other problems of conquering the African interior were solved by the Industrial Revolution. Steamships and steam railroads allowed for travel up African rivers and for movement of large amounts of troops and resources inland. And then there's the development of the very first machine guns, giving Europeans a huge military advantage over African soldiers who did not have this level of military technology. So here we have a solution to most of the problems keeping Europeans out of the African interior, right? Quinine is solving for the malaria issue, steamships and railroads are solving transportation needs, the Maxim gun is creating this military advantage of a way to mow down a lot of people with only one soldier. So that drastically shifts the balance of power, but there's one other big thing that really helps Europeans take Africa in this period. So African societies were not weak, but those powerful empires faced pressure that made resistance more difficult. So first and foremost, they had been going through centuries of the Atlantic slave trade up to this point. That is, millions of people had been kidnapped from Africa and sold into slavery. This is a massive population drain. And because of the pressure to participate in the slave trade, because if you're not the one going and conquering other areas to kidnap people to sell to Europeans, then you're the ones who are being conquered and kidnapped to be sold to Europeans. This increased warfare between African kingdoms and empires that led to a weakening of all of them. And once Europeans start moving into the interior of the continent, these rivalries are really hard to put aside, so they're not going to work together to resist Europeans because there's this deep-seated anger between the African empires. And since Europeans industrialized first and Africans had not yet industrialized, there was a lack of industrial weapons, putting Africans at a huge disadvantage. Not to mention that coordinating resistance across these large, vast swaths of land was extremely difficult. European powers often exploited all these divisions to their advantage. But this was not just happening in Africa. European imperialism had expanded across the globe at this point. Right? India had been under British control for a very long time by this point. Southeast Asia had to come under the French colonial powers. This area became to be known as French Indochina. Later, this section becomes Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, so these countries are part of the French Empire at this point. And the Ottoman Empire, which used to be this powerhouse, controlled a huge area, while the Europeans are kind of making inroads into formerly Ottoman territories, as the Ottomans, the empire that finally took out the Romans, had been around for several centuries at this point, but they called it the old sick man of Europe because it was slowly dying off as it was being chipped away at piece by the other European powers. And China, this powerhouse of an empire far out east, is under growing European economic influence. Europeans aren't really colonizing it, but they're demanding more control over the Chinese economy. This is best displayed in the two opium wars. That's right, opium, a drug that the British fought against the Chinese because the British were international drug dealers who wanted to sell opium, that's right, the addictive drug opium, to people in China, but the Chinese emperor was like, no, I don't want you selling this to my people, so he banned it from happening, and so the British went to war with China, not once, but twice, to force China to allow them to sell opium and get their people addicted to a massive drug. So imperialism is drastically reshaping power relationships across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, as these countries are getting more and more under the influence of Europeans who are on the ascendancy at this point. As the 1800s progressed, European powers started to compete for colonies in areas that they had not previously been able to colonize. This was also part of national prestige, as having a large empire was seen as a point of pride for the people of these European nations. And because there was so much money to be made, strategic trade routes became critical to control. Again, these industrialized countries were in competition for those raw materials for their factories, markets to sell their resources to, territory and influence to prove that they're better than everyone else. So, the scramble for Africa was one part of this much larger transformation, and the industrial powers were now competing globally for these colonies, resources, strategic territory, and global influence. I keep saying these things over and over again, but it's important to understand. These rivalries would continue to increase tensions between these European powers and eventually contributes to the conflicts that lead to World War I. In class, we're going to look a little closer at this scramble for Africa, so exactly how this happened and how Africans resisted. Sometimes they resisted and won, and many times they resisted and did not win. That's what we're going to look at in class when we come back together. For now, as always, rewrite today's goal, write 3 of those important facts, complete thoughts, and 1 question you still have that I can answer for you. Until I see you next time, have a good one.